Okay, so I think we'll get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first session of the Westminster Development Policy Network virtual seminars. We're very excited to launch this seminar series this fall. My name is Bahram Mirkasimov, and I am joining today from Westminster International University in Tashkent. Today, we're very excited to have Dr. Karen Jackson from the University of Westminster and to discuss her topic on risky business, political stability along the Belt and Road. A bit of biography about Karen Jackson. Karen is an associate professor in economics and assistant head of school for organizations, economy, and society, and senior regional coordinator for Westminster Business School. She previously worked at the University of Bradford, UK Department for International Development, and the University of Sussex. So she does work on international trade, finance, and development. She finished her PhD at the University of Sussex, and she's a longtime friend of Westminster International University in Tashkent because the University of Westminster is our strategic partner, and we're very excited to have this jointly together today. And to discuss her presentation is our longtime friend from IFPRI, Dr. Kamjan Akramov. And so with that, I would like to remind our viewers, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A function at the end, or if you would like to ask comments during the presentation, use the chat function. Either way, I'll try to ask all the questions you have at the end. So Karen, floor is yours.
Thank you, Bakram. That's great. So welcome everybody. My name is Karen Jackson. This paper is with Alexander Shepatillo from Aston University in the UK. And I think he's actually joining us today, listening in. This is part of a sort of broader set of work, really, that I've done looking at the Belt and Road, where this particular paper is going to look at the issue of the Belt and Road and political stability and how that impacts on trade and inevitably welfare. So let me just give you a bit of motivation for the paper. I guess for anybody who's been watching what's been going on in the UK, the idea of sort of strap lines or slogans is familiar territory since Get Brexit Done won the recent election, essentially. But of course, these kind of slogans are not just used in the UK. They're used extensively in Chinese economic policy making. What, of course, is interesting about the Belt and Road Initiative is the fact that the Belt and Road and, let me say, the new type of great power relations, these two straplines, they pivot China towards an international audience. So these are probably some of the early examples of slogans and policies that were really intended for international audiences. There is lots of other slogans and other policies, of course, that came before them, which feed into these to a great extent. And I would argue that actually these two policies are overlapping to some degree. But I thought it would just be worth spending a couple of minutes just thinking about exactly what we mean by these two policies. So I'm just going to start with maybe the second one, the new type of great power relations. I think one of the things that's worth bearing in mind about this policy is it was initially directed at the US. So it was initially the case that Xi Jinping tried to sort of get buy-in from President Obama on this policy. It didn't get a lot of traction, I think it would be fair to say. And of course, has got even less traction under President Trump. This is not to say that these policies kind of live or die by the reception they get in places like the US, because these are still sort of narratives that come out of China, nevertheless. And this kind of notion of cooperation, of non-confrontation. This is the kind of narrative that China wants to be known for internationally. This then does, of course, dovetail to a large extent with the Belt and Road policy, because the Belt and Road policy, at its heart, is about infrastructure development projects. What is, of course, interesting is that all trade routes sort of end in Europe, but of course, much of the sort of the initiative is actually targeted at the trade routes before you reach Europe. Now, of course, the other interesting fact is that Europe also haven't been terribly receptive to the Belt and Road policy. With the exception of Greece and Italy, it's received very weak reception in Europe. Nevertheless, there's 65 plus countries which seek to potentially gain through the infrastructure projects which are proposed under this policy. But perhaps just bring it back to the trade lens with which we look at things in this paper, it's worth just mentioning that really trade routes are key to this. So, for China, the sea routes, and for anybody shipping, for anybody wanting to transport goods, uh, sea routes are in fact, of course, the cheapest way to ship goods, albeit the slowest. And of course, for China, they have a problem in that regard because the South China Sea is contested, and there's a very narrow strait, which is called the Malacca Strait, where only few ships can pass at any one time, and it's also got the problem of piracy along this strait. So there's real logic to trying to open up alternative trade routes through land routes, which might be through rail or by truck. And what is very clear is that these two policies are a big shift, where these are internationally focused policies, which is a big change in Chinese economic policy making. So what about, what do other people have to say about this? Well, of course, there's lots of literature looking at the BRI in general, but there's relatively little sort of serious economic analysis that's being done looking at the BRI. I would suggest that a lot of the really credible work that's come out recently has really come from the World Bank. One of the studies I've highlighted here by DeSores is really interesting because they attempt to kind of estimate the trade cost reductions which will take place as a result of the BRI. But I think what's lacking at the moment, and what we argue in the paper, is that this isn't purely an economic project. There's a clear political dimension. And I think it would be naive to suggest that really all we're talking about are investments which will lead to trade cost reductions, which will then have trade impacts and welfare impacts. We just need to think about the context of Chinese investments in Africa. And we see, in fact, of course, that these investments were made in Africa, but they were accompanied by lots of kind of political support. So, when there were issues around conflict in South Sudan, it was China that sat at the table, as part of the UN trying to negotiate peace. I'm not suggesting that all of the involvement that China's had in Africa should be viewed positively at all, but I'm just suggesting that there's clearly been more than just China entering into making economic investments. There is a recognition that this has to be accompanied by other political energies being devoted to supporting these investments. In fact, the statistics show that China has been one of the most active in the UN Security Council when it comes to peacekeeping in Africa. So with that in mind, really, this paper tries to bridge that gap and tries to pull together these themes around political risk and political stability and alignment of political views with the idea of the BRI and the trade focus. So one of the other areas I should just mention is, of course, that there is this quite large literature that's recent but fairly large, looking at politics and trade. Um, the interesting part of this literature is that not all of it, but quite a lot, is very focused on the idea of diverging political opinions and how this negatively affects trade and welfare. And of course, in the Chinese context, there's the famous paper that looks at the Dalai Lama effect, by welcoming officially the Dalai Lama, what a negative effect it has on your trade. Um, so I guess this paper is a different contribution because it looks at the idea that actually a Chinese policy will help align political views potentially and support the sort of positive effect on political risk, and that this will have an effect on trade. So it's somewhat different from what the existing literature focuses on. Um, well, we look at two questions in this paper. The first question is essentially quite straightforward, and it says, okay, so what are the effects of these changes in the political environment um, due to the BRI on trade and welfare? So we're not claiming that we're going to look at all of the potential impacts. We're looking at this policy and or these policies through a trade lens. Okay, so we're pretty upfront about that at the start. But the other thing that we really want to do in this paper is we want to kind of measure the gains that you might get through, let me call them the conventional channels that we might pay attention to as economists. So we want to compare the reductions in trade costs and the trade and welfare implications those have. And we want to compare that impact with what you might get from changes in the political environment. I guess at this point, I would like to just say that, the analysis that we do, it's illustrative. So we're not trying to claim the precise measures that we look at are going to actually take place. But what we're trying to do is benchmark things and give an illustration of the types of impacts that we might see. So how do we do this in our paper? Well, we adopt a structural model of global trade. So that means that we have essentially a large number, not all the countries obviously in the world, but we have a large number of countries included within the model. We follow the approach by Anderson et al. From 2018, a couple of years ago. We do amend the model, so in three particular ways. The first way is that we recognise that political preferences have a role in consumption. Second, that production is influenced by how stable your institutions are, to what degree property rights are protected, and to what extent you have political stability. And thirdly, we then consider the more direct impact that political factors have on trade costs. So we make these amendments, and I'm going to explain a bit more in a few minutes. And what we do is we generate welfare effects of this BRI policy, and we generate general equilibrium results. Now, I'm going to actually show you both the full general equilibrium results and the conditional general equilibrium results. You don't actually have to do the conditional general equilibrium results. It's not a necessary prerequisite, but I'll just show you them for interest. And how do we actually kind of explore the policy? Well, we explore the policy by setting up a number of scenarios. So, what if? And we try and explore these and follow them through and calculate the changes in trade and welfare gains. Obviously, the idea of these kind of what if scenarios, as I say, is not that they're precise science that we know exactly what's going to happen, in fact. far from it. We know little often we find about the BRI projects, partly because all the information isn't readily available. But what we do is we try and produce these scenarios so that we can have these kind of illustrative impacts. So what I would like to do is just sort of very briefly, because we could spend the whole half hour talking about the model, but I don't want to do that. I want to just very briefly kind of motivate the approach we take. Of course, the sort of origins of the gravity model, which is what we use, date back to the 1960s, where the criticism was that it didn't have a theoretical basis to it. Of course, this was responded to essentially in the 1970s, but it's relatively recent, the 1990s, 2000s, where we see the use of gravity modeling really be more pronounced in the trade literature. It's one of the most dominant approaches now. And I think the reason for that is pretty clear. It's because the previous attempts, let me call them the kind of the sort of first wave of gravity models, they estimated bilateral trade flows very well, but the problem was that the estimates weren't particularly consistent or unbiased. So what I will call the sort of new wave of gravity modeling is referred to as structural gravity modeling. It tries to respond to these issues that were raised around estimate being biased and inconsistent. And so we use this kind of new wave of structural gravity modeling in what we do. So what I've got here on equation one, in really simple terms, is obviously on the left-hand side, you've got your bilateral trade flows. And there's two terms here. So the terms in front of the brackets on the right-hand side, we might just consider that to be the size term. And inside the brackets, we've got what we might consider to be the trade cost term. The size term in very simple, kind of intuitive language is really trying to show how much bilateral trade would take place if, in fact, there were no frictions to trade. And then the trade cost term, of course, is the kind of the wedge between this frictionless trade and the reality. So this is the basic kind of representation for the structural gravity approach. And of course, the important terms that you need to sort of capture through the process of conducting structural gravity modeling are in simple language. The idea is that they capture the fact that two countries will in fact trade more if they're more remote from all other countries. So in kind of Krugman language, two countries that are situated within Europe are going to trade more than two countries that are situated, are going to trade less than two countries that are situated on Mars. So we do need to capture these multilateral resistance terms, which aren't, of course, observable. So the other important feature of structural gravity modeling is the trade costs. And there's some really standard things we put into the trade costs. So we consider that, of course, the costs vary according to whether you've got a common language, you've got a common legal system, you've got a common border. But for our purposes, and of course, distance between countries, but for our purposes, what we also want to do is to incorporate some of these political variables. So I've just incorporated one here to make it sort of readable, but PA, let's assume that that's political affinity. One of the things just to bear in mind about this approach to incorporating these political variables into the structural gravity modeling is that, of course, you are somewhat restricted with what things you can capture in this way, in the sense that they have to be bilateral in nature. So the fact is that we'll see that our political affinity measure is a bilateral measure. Okay, and I'll describe that a bit more in a moment. What we can't do is put things into trade costs which are actually just country specific. Ultimately, the end of these and these kind of processes, you want to get two things out of them. You want to get an idea of how trade is affected, so exports in this case, and the other thing we want to get an idea about is the welfare effect. So, as I mentioned, we'll calculate the full general equilibrium effect, but I'll show you the conditional impacts as well. So I know this looks terribly complicated for anybody who's not sort of been involved in this area, but I did want to just mention the sort of key model parameters, which are a bit more unique to how we set it up in this paper. So there are a number of things that we want to do at, let me call it, the first stage of the modelling. We need to capture certain bits of information, and these are sort of threefold. The first is, you remember that I suggested that political stability, and remember, political stability is a country-specific thing, so it's not a bilateral thing. So political stability enters through this production function estimation, and we estimate the production function, and the aim is to capture the A2 highlighted in red here, so that we can identify the effect of political stability on production. And then we use this measure in the second stage of our procedure. The second thing in equation 8 that I highlight is we actually run the gravity model. I haven't spelled out all the parameters, so included in Z or all of these things like the common border, the common language, etc. But what we want to capture from this first stage gravity model is we want to understand the parameters gamma MA and gamma PA. So those are those bilateral measures of, in this case, political affinity and military alliance, which then we want to identify the effect that they have on trade, and we need to use those parameters in the second stage of our modelling. The third thing we need to do is we need to have an idea about what effect we would expect the BRI to have or on political affinity. We need to have this measure. So the way we calculate this is we actually take our full data set, and I'll describe it in a moment. We take the full data set and we basically look at when countries would sign a regional trade agreement, indicated as an RTA here, what would the impact be on political affinity? And then that gamma, highlighted in red in equation 9, that gamma is what we capture, and we use that, and we say that we assume the BRI will have that effect on political affinity. So a country that joins the BRI will actually expect to have the same type of effect. So just very briefly, without going into too much detail, one of the final things I wanted to explain about the methodological approach was actually how we conduct not just structural gravity modelling, but how do we do it with a counterfactual analysis. So one of the slightly confusing things about it is there's lots of steps, unfortunately. But essentially, you usually estimate now structural gravity equations using the PPML estimation. And so we do that. And what we do in the first stage is we use our actual data. So I'm going to explain this actual data in a minute. We then aim to recover those multilateral resistance terms that I mentioned earlier that are important. We compute the welfare, the status quo welfare, let's say. And then the second stage starts where we have these scenarios, which I'm going to mention, and we basically try to tweak our policy variables to represent the scenarios that we've set up. We then estimate again the model with the new tweaked policy variables. We collect or recover the new multilateral resistance terms. We compute the welfare indices and find what the change in trade is. And then we basically take our old kind of values for exports, our new estimated exports, and the same for welfare. And we compare the two. So we look at the change. So in terms of the data, we've got a data set running from 1960 to 2018. For the status quo, we use 2018 as our kind of status quo when we're using for comparison to our new scenarios. We've got 160 countries. A couple of things worth mentioning about the data. Most of this is fairly standard in the gravity modeling literature. One thing worth highlighting for this new wave of gravity modeling, you do need to have internal trade as well as external trade to make your estimates consistent and unbiased. And obviously, we want to have the political data. So I'm going to explain in a bit more detail in a moment, but the political stability data, which is by country, comes from the World Bank governance indicators. The political relationships data based on the UN voting data comes from ideal points difference index, which I'll explain in a moment. The information on which alliances exist, which formal alliances exist between two countries, which is bilateral, comes from the Correlates of War database. And the remaining data is fairly standard with the trade policy and trade cost data coming from CEPI. So the counterfactual scenarios, the what ifs. So what do we propose? So the first one I'm not going to sort of ponder too much because actually the BRI scenario, which is the sort of the trade cost reductions that we might expect to see as a result of the BRI projects. This is actually subject of a whole paper discussing what we might expect. So we've done another paper which looks at a whole variety of possible different trade cost reductions and discusses this at some length. One option, of course, for the trade cost reduction assumptions is that we could consider these estimates that come out of the World Bank research. We do that in our other paper, and we compare across the board, so across all of the BRI countries and Europe, I should say, standard blanket reductions. We compare the results then to sort of more calibrated trade cost reductions, which are predicted by the World Bank research. It really doesn't make a lot of difference to the results, is the answer. For the purpose of this, and because it's really being used as a benchmark and it's not the central purpose of the paper, we've just applied a 15% trade cost reduction. Okay, we go into quite a bit of detail about how you justify that. There is, of course, quite a bit of literature also looking at other types of projects which have been deployed, even going back to the kind of development of the Indian railroads. So if I now talk about the other three scenarios, so the first one I want to discuss is the military alliance. Second, the idea of this political affinity, so a closeness of political views. And the third is this political stability. So let me just, I'm not going to talk in a lot of detail, but I do want to just mention a few points about these because they're really central to sort of driving the results for the paper. The defense alliances. One thing to bear in mind is that we're not making a claim that all of these 65 plus countries are actually going to form a defense alliance with China. Okay, that's the assumption in the scenario, but that's not what we're suggesting is the reality. We're trying to set a sort of benchmark and say, if you had that extreme outcome where you had a lot of consensus and you had all of these formal alliances across all of the BRI countries, what kind of sort of economic results would we see? Now, of course, the reality is that a formal defense alliance, there is only, in fact, a formal defense alliance between China and North Korea at present. Now, there are other types of alliances that China has at the present time, short of a formal sort of military alliance, a defense alliance. But I think what's really important in this scenario is thinking through how this might happen moving forward, how these alliances might be formed. Um, One is that, in fact, it's increasingly the case that trade and investment agreements have some element of political alliance embedded within them. You can have a look at some of the cases in an Africa context and you can see that. So it's possible that that would be the case. The other thing, though, I really would like to emphasize is that much of the agreement that is kind of as a result of the BRI projects. So take the one, between Greece and China, for example. That agreement hasn't been sort of recognized, it hasn't been reported to the WTO. It's a kind of secret agreement which is kept, which is not in the public domain. So there's a lot of agreements which are of a trade and investment nature, but are not reported to the WTO. And of course, they may quite reasonably have a political agreement sort of attached to them. Um, so I think we just have to be mindful that we'll use the correlates of war database for the existing data, but the future may well be that these alliances are not quite so transparent. The other thing that we use is the political affinity data. Now, this is based on UN voting data. And obviously, raw UN voting data is not really what you want to use. You want to use an index derived from it. There are actually quite a few indexes based on UN voting data. Probably a bit of consensus has kind of emerged from the political literature, which uses this data, which is that if you're wanting to get an idea of political views over a longer period of time, the ideal point differences are pretty good to use, because what they do in these estimates is they kind of remove the UN votes on particular issues which might really swing the index. So what they try to do is they only look at issues which remain broadly stable and are voted on over time. So I picked out here just to illustrate, so you can get a sort of feel for this. Just picked out 5 countries, which, to the best of our knowledge, and it is the best of our knowledge because it's not publicly available, we've collected information about which countries receive what investment. And to the best of our knowledge, these are the top 5 recipients. So what these lines show is that this is the political affinity based on the UN voting data between China and each of these countries. And so what you do see is there is a kind of convergence taking place over time. The third one I wanted to talk about in terms of the political scenarios was the idea of political stability. Now, this is the one that enters when we talk about productivity, because this is based on individual countries. It's not a bilateral measure. Based on the World Bank governance indicators, and the assumption we make in the paper is that the BRI countries would achieve the political stability, which is the average already achieved in Europe and Central Asia as of 2014. So, one thing to just bear in mind when you look at the PS scenarios and you find that there is, in fact, either absolutely no impact of the political stability scenario or very low impact, is basically because these countries have already achieved this level of political stability that's equal to Europe and Central Asia. So I wanted, we've got the results basically for all the BRI countries, but I felt I was trying to think of a neat way to kind of show it, and I was thinking about to produce some graphs. In the paper, all the results are there, but it's a bit difficult on slides. So I thought it would be better just to summarize the key results by region. And we'll start with the trade effects, so the export effects. This is percent by region. We've got our four scenarios, BRI, DA, PA, PS. You've got the average effect, just so you can see that at the end. And so you get a picture here of the kind of trade creation, trade diversion effects you might expect. So what you'll notice is that the negative effects are coming from the regions which are not involved in the BRI. Yeah, so the North America effect, the Latin and Caribbean negative effects, and then you're seeing the positive effects really dominating around South Asia. Now, while all the roads or the routes, the trade routes end in Europe, really there's a lot of activity on the part of China in connection with South Asia. The older policies like the Go West initiative that was aimed at developing the relatively poor west part of China was really very proactively aimed at trying to build links with South Asia. There's a lot of investment predating the BRI that has gone to South Asia. So these are kind of in line with what we might expect. The PS column, just remember that the zeros are really where you're not getting an effect, or the small effects are derived from the fact that they've already really met that average political stability. You get a bit more of a nuanced view, of course, when you look at the individual country results. The other thing I'd just like to point out, which isn't clear from the regional results, but that's quite interesting, is that Central and Eastern European country group. They get quite a good positive effect from the BRI and these other political scenarios. And of course, anybody who knows a bit about what's been going on with this policy will realise that this grouping has now been joined, for example, by Greece as well. So this is an important group in the context of discussions around the BRI. The sort of more moderate increases in exports are actually felt by India, Vietnam, the Philippines, and Laos. So if I turn to these welfare changes, you might remember I mentioned that you can derive conditional general equilibrium effects and full general equilibrium effects. The conditional equilibrium effects basically don't include the added gains from income and expenditure. And so what you expect to see is that you've got your full general equilibrium effects are bigger. Yeah. So the interesting part, of course, which I started with my questions, what we wanted to answer in this paper, are that we wanted to sort of get a comparison of the political scenarios, so TA, PA, and PS, compared to our 15% reductions under the BRI. So if I focus on the full general equilibrium results for the moment, because they're really the ones we would sort of put forward as being more credible, you would sometimes refer to your conditional results in the appendix, in fact. And the full general equilibrium effects, what you notice is, of course, forming a defence alliance is a really big potential gain. Now, we have to be cautious because in this defence alliance scenario, we have assumed that all the countries along the Belt and Road, all 65 plus, are signing a defence alliance with China. Now, that's not plausible, and at least probably in our lifetime. But as we move anywhere close to that kind of even unofficial allegiance, we might start to see really significant returns, and returns that actually dwarf those that we would get from trade cost reductions. So that is probably the number one finding really from this paper. The other political scenarios, what you notice is they're still significant. So the indirect economic effect coming from political change is equally important to be considered as what these kind of simple, straightforward trade cost reductions, which are often talked about in the economics literature. So in conclusion, hopefully I'm to time. There was two main outcomes, and these are largely focused around South Asia. So the military alliances between the BRI countries and China are going to have really pronounced positive effects in South Asia. And the same is true about increased political stability. This is going to have the most pronounced positive effects in South Asia. And then just more broadly, what we try to really illustrate here through this exercise is that we can't really consider trade cost reductions alone. We really do need to consider the accompanying political changes which will take place that will have economic effects. So I'll leave it there so we've got plenty of time for questions. If anybody would like to sort of see a copy of the paper afterwards, or ask me any other questions you didn't get a chance to do, then please feel free to email me or contact me on Twitter.
Okay, thank you, Karen, very much. So I would like to ask Kamjan to say a few words, 5 minutes, 5 to 7 minutes, and then in the meantime, please feel free to send your questions over, and then I will ask all the questions from the audience. So, Kamjan.
Thank you, Karen. Good morning. So, yeah, this is very interesting paper, and you did a great job presenting the paper and findings, and I really liked it actually. When China started this Belt and Road Initiative, expectations about the positive impact of this on trade, on welfare in many parts of the world, including Central Asia, was great. And so I think this paper is very informative, and it provides a lot of insights how BRI may impact trade and welfare in countries involved in this initiative. So I will start with your main assumptions. I think one of the key assumptions here you mentioned in the beginning, it's in the paper as well, new type of great power relations. So which may lead to cooperation and non-confrontation. But I thought actually in this kind of environment where we are now, how plausible is this kind of assumption actually? Of course, maybe this is just a one-time thing, and it may change after election in US or so. But again, and it will be very interesting to hear your perspective on this. And the main question you are trying to explore here is to understand the link between political stability, political alignment, BRI, and trade. So this is especially, I like that you use this general equilibrium approach and also to use the different scenarios and to produce the counterfactuals. And this is, I think, very helpful. So I have several points here, but since we have very little time here, I will focus on a couple of things. One, actually, about your finding is actually this among the scenarios, defense alliance with China has most positive effect on trade and welfare. So, yeah, again, I wonder how plausible is it. You already mentioned that actually, and how other great powers will see this if this will happen. Let's assume this will happen, and how other great powers like US or Russia will see this kind of development, and how this kind of development may impact their trade with other countries. And yeah, you have general theory model. I'm not sure if you estimated or tried to consider that kind of effect in your modeling strategy. And another point, and since most of our listeners are from Central Asia, I would like to say a few words about from Central Asia perspective. Yeah, China is major trading partner for most Central Asian countries now. Actually, China is number one trading partner for Uzbekistan and some other Central Asian countries. It's actually Russia is now number two, and China is also becoming major investment partner for Central Asian countries. China is investing in many areas of the region, in different sectors of the economies of the Central Asian countries. So yeah, in this regard, I think you have actually, you didn't mention more in your presentation, but that's in your paper, in your results. Actually, you have specific results for East Central Asian countries. Again, that defense scenario, counterfactual scenario, produces actually most positive effect in terms of trade between Central Asian countries and China, and also welfare impact on Central Asian countries. So, yeah, this is again, I think, needs some further explanation. Whether this, how the Central Asian countries or Central Asia in between three great powers, right? China on the east and Russia on the north, and US is far away, but still US is actually very influential in the region. So how other great powers will see if one day Central Asian countries will start a defense alliance or agreement with China, and how Central Asian governments will see this kind of perspective. So yeah, and the last point about data, and I like that you have actually very good data sources. I used some of those data in my research before, and this is good. And the only thing actually, I guess you said actually you used data from 1960 to 2018. And again, from Central Asian countries, they are just started from after 1990. And so they appear in your database after that, or you did some kind of trick to include using data from previous regime. Yeah, I will stop here. And thank you again. This is a great paper, and I read it with great interest. Thank you very much, guys.
Karen.
Sure. Thank you so much. Shall I respond to these comments first of all? Thank you so much for the comments. I mean, they're really very interesting, and I should just say that we haven't completely finished the paper yet. So, I mean, these are really useful points to think about. I guess I'll pick up on the last one first because it's really easy to kind of reply to. You're right. We're not terribly clear at the moment in the version of the paper you've read about how we cope with the fact that we haven't got a full 1960 to 2018 data set for all the countries. And it's something actually in a paper we're just about to publish in World Economy that we've spelled out more clearly. So I think we need to do a bit of work to kind of spell it out like we have in one of these other papers. Because I agree, particularly around the Central Asian economies, it's important to be clear about how we manage the data gaps. We do that, but we need to be a bit clearer in the paper. And in terms of then, I think your question about the new type of great power relations and how plausible is it? I mean, I guess my view is that you're absolutely right. Of course, there's lots of tensions, and it's a very good question from that point of view. I mean, my feeling is that ultimately when China decided to make what are very significant investments for them in these countries along the Belt and Road, that they were willing to see greater political alignment. They were tacitly saying that they're not going to actually allow for political risk to escalate, either because it's originated from the country itself or because even if there's some divergence of views, they will do everything they can to kind of mitigate that. That's my feeling. My feeling is we'll see what happens in Africa, that we'll see them also, using the seat on the UN Security Council if needed, to sort of exert some authority over some countries where there is a sort of instability. I think it's a really excellent question, actually, and one about the Russia and the US and how they respond. And of course, actually, we have another paper which looks at Brexit and considers what could be the reaction of other European countries. And it's kind of, I guess, a little bit like the question you're asking here, which is, okay, so China signs or even informally agrees a kind of alliance with another country, but surely there's a reaction from the US, surely there's a reaction from Russia. And of course, yeah, I mean, it's tricky to do too much without getting too complicated in the gravity approach. But we can do more. And we had actually had a bit of discussion around, for example, trying to model in another, in a future work, trying to model some of the other types of infrastructure investment projects which are led by the US or led by other countries, of which, of course, there are quite a lot. I mean, the BRI is the big example, but actually, the US does have its own push towards these kind of infrastructure development projects, as do other countries, including Japan. So I think for another paper, I think this is a really interesting road to go down, to have a look about if we can model more broadly other competing initiatives, I guess, and how they interact. But yeah, the area, I guess the last thing I'll say is just that the area you highlighted about explaining a bit more about the nuances around the gains and losses for different countries, and particularly the gains in the Central Asian context. Yeah, that's the sort of the bit of work we still have to do, and I totally agree. It's work in progress. And yeah, we need to do more to sort of interpret across the different regions what's happening. I think yours, yeah.
Okay, thank you, Karen, and thank you, Komjanaka. So I did not receive any questions that were not asked by or addressed by Komjan Kramp already in his discussion. So Karen, my last question before we go. So in your presentation, the research question was, let me read this quickly. Sorry. So basically, it was which is more important, given the BRI, trade costs or the political environment? So what's the short answer?
I think the short answer is that the political alignment, the reduction in political risks, could be equally or more important than the reductions in trade costs. And I think they will be if we believe that, in fact, China will defend its investments, politically, by supporting these countries and aligning views.
And that's through the your models, through the military alliances and so on.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. One.
Okay. Yes.
I think Chinese perspective on political stability and Western perspective, or U.S. Perspective in particular, may be quite different, right? And So that's also, I guess, very important question to consider in the research.
I think that's an excellent point. I mean, having lived in China, I think I was just overwhelmed by the value that Chinese people put in political stability. I think that is an issue we have to bear in mind, and I think confrontation and discord is not something that sits comfortably culturally. So I think this will add more weight to kind of calming the waters, which are definitely not calm at the moment. But I think protecting the investments and the kind of cultural attachment to a much calmer political environment, I think will play part. But I think you're totally right. Political stability means totally different things in different cultural environments.
Okay. With that, I concur with Common John saying this is a very interesting paper, and we will upload the slides and the video on our website, conference.wiut.uz. So thank you very much again to our speakers, Karen and Common John, and wish best of luck in revising this paper. And I would like just to thank our viewers and remind you next week we have Professor Jeffrey Sachs from Columbia University who will join us, and you'll receive an email with more detail. So with that, colleagues, thank you very much and have a good day or morning or evening your time. So bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.